So in today's video on chromatistics, or continuation of that theme, we'll look at Norway and why it's being mega idiotic in its implementation of a tax scheme. So Norway is one of the latest countries in Europe to latch onto this idea that you can tax wealthy people to increase the amount of tax funds in the purse such that you can then distribute those to cover certain public expenditures that you're looking to make. Norway has, in its very lax and easygoing attitude, decided to elect a series of leftist candidates, basically over the last 50 years, in which there's been a continuous increase in the rate of leftist policies, ranging from extension of public welfare to those not so in need, including pensions and whatnot, not means tested, all the way through to millions of immigrants. Now, this is not obviously an exception, so there wouldn't be worth doing a video on, except lately they've decided to implement, as I said, this wealth tax increase, and this was adjudged by whatever economic department in the Norwegian government, as per the party guidelines, to increase their tax revenues X%. And so the idea was that you have really wealthy people built their wealth in Norway using Norwegians at Norwegian companies, obviously. And now we want their wealth to be taxed so that they are less wealthy, and you're all better off, relatively speaking, because we're going to bring down the top end much closer to the median. It's subject to two things. The first thing is wealth is not indicative of, say, cash on hand, like an asset. So it's only really retarded politicians that do this because they've never had to work a job and they've not been inculcated in how finances actually work. But it's like if you had house equity of $200,000 on your house and you had a $100,000 mortgage. So $300,000 is the total equity value you had, the asset value, we'll say. So, and then the government says, look, I'm going to tax you on that $200,000 of house equity you have. And you go, well, I don't really have the cash to pay you a tax on something that's worth something. We can all agree, but I don't have the cash for it because it's not, say, a cash generating asset, or it's not something where you necessarily will be able to cover that. And they go, well, you'll have to take a mortgage, or you have to pay it out of your income tax. So now you have to take cash into or outside of the business, or like remortgage your house or something to get cash out to then pay the government what they feel is their due now on one of your assets. This is the idea behind it in a very loose way. And what that has taught us is that billionaires will probably just leave because as nationalistic and patriotic as some billionaires have been, particularly in Scandinavia, if you don't know, has a core essence of Gothic Prussianism. It's almost this latent fascism where they have a very high opinion, in a good way, of their countries and the blood and soil. They intrinsically understand this, if not extrinsically show the opposite, where they try to be very humble and humility and all of these pretenses around this, but they strongly feel that their countries are the best and that they govern in that way. You see the collapse of Sweden reflecting this in a very perverse way, where there's an inverse of, look, if we're so good as Sweden, maybe we should just feel bad for everyone else because they're pathetic losers, invite them in, see if we can help them. And obviously you can't help the Fellaheen. The Fellaheen are just parasitical, and so once they parasitise your country and suck all the wealth out, then you start to realise that maybe these people aren't contributing. Norway's not there yet because they have a much stronger economy than Sweden. They took in relatively less, although they did take in the same terrible demographics of third worlders that Sweden did. Now, but the point being here that the very rich, the billionaire class, are being taxed, or sought to be taxed on a wealth level rather than an income level. And there's many different ways to do taxes and fees and surcharges and all of these things. But the way that wealth taxes work, well, they don't work really, is that if you have a mobile class that is not going to have the rules apply to them, they just leave. So you can only tax something where it's enforceable on that. You know that the game theory here tells you that people will stay and thus pay that tax. Usually it's much easier to stomach, for instance, some sort of corporate tax or a dividend or capital gains tax, for instance, because then you say, like, look, this is capital earning capital. We're going to increase the rates on this, and this only affects people who have capital already. And it's still not a great way to enlarge your tax base because more taxes aren't always correspondent to higher tax revenues per se. It's one thing to say like, my tax base currently is 100 and I'm going to increase it just by increasing 10% on 100 by taxing people 10% more, rather than saying like, could I grow my 100 to 200 and then that is now just doubled by some other means. Usually it's economic growth and things like this. Trump has a good way of doing it with tariffs. So if you're a net exporter importer and you know that the things that you have are valuable, Norway's done this through a sovereign wealth fund based on its oil and gas reserves. So Einar Gerhardsen here, who was the probably only good, semi-good Norwegian politician ever to exist since Norwegian Viking kings, obviously Harald Hardrada and etc. But if you consider modern politics, he's probably the only one that had a semblance of competence to him, had foresaw that oil and gas was going to be a lottery ticket, more or less, for Norway. And in doing so, develops this idea that there's a mandated amount of the wealth generated from oil and gas goes into this sovereign wealth fund. The fund has very strict guidelines around how it's able and not able to disperse wealth back to the Norwegian public. So the slew of very communist-leaning Norwegian publicly elected democratic officials can't just drain the purse. They have to have limitations on that. They actually did take withdrawals on this Norwegian Wealth Fund a few years back because they were so bad at managing budgets, and they've done that obviously once again because they're leftists who just want to spend money as much money as possible on brown people because they feel bad. And so this goes into that what the Benito Mussolini is saying, everything within the state, nothing outside of the state, nothing against the state. It is this core ethos that the Norwegian and the broader Scandinavians live by. You can see here that the wealth generated out of Norway is basically oil and gas. It's 50% of their GDP from an industry sector perspective. And the rest is just fishermen and other agricultural like byproducts like trees and wood and things like that, steel. So you can clearly see their economy, if it didn't have oil and gas, would just be fishermen in huts and then a few lumberjacks. Now, this is not a bad thing necessarily. It's not to diminish or besmirch the Norwegian. I know many good Norwegians, and the industriousness of a Norwegian is not to be, say, called into. Well, it's not to be downplayed, but it is to say that they're very clearly only a country of any note because of their oil and gas reserves, a bit like Saudi Arabia, a bit like UAE and Australia, in that their GDP is represented by natural reserves in which they don't really have to work hard at doing anything with other than extracting and then selling on. And so their economy here, you can see the GDP per capita took off in the late 80s, and this is correspondent to oil prices in a lot of ways and gas prices. So it's very easy to see that they were in line with all the other OECD, currently OECD, but Western European countries. And you can see how poor they were. They were extremely poor in the 40s and 50s. Obviously, coming out of the war, they were occupied by Germany, and so had to, I would say, rebuild. But they had to orientate their country towards a certain goal that was aligned with NATO and America. And so what they did is basically establish the same sort of capitalist market principles and then go along the same lines. So you see the linear growth here, and it would have been fine for them. Obviously, being at Sweden's level is nothing to laugh at or belittle, but Norway is far and away the largest and starkest, most impressive nation here, and that's all because of their oil and gas reserves. So what does that mean? Well, it means that the politicians have this understanding that Norway is rich in their heads, and that rich Norwegians owe that to Norway in general. It embodies in you a certain level of egalitarian communistic feeling if you're in a political party, for instance, and you have never earned very much money because you have no talent, and the only reason you joining a political party is because you have no other outlet for anything that you want to do, and so you go, well, I'm going to join the red left party here in Norway and make people pay for all of these things that I want and all the brown people around me want. And this is the, I'm not even being facetious or we say like painting like a hyperbole. This is the actual mentality of these people. How much can I get out of a system in terms of leeching because of my inability to comprehend economics from a input-output standpoint? And what you get then is an economy, once again, that punishes wealthy people because wealthy people are easy to point at. They, in one of the Norwegian party's head offices, they had a wall of shame, which is the rich people who left Norway on the advent and implementation of this tax. So they have a wall of shame for a rich person who doesn't want to have to start paying tax on their net worth rather than income. And say, okay, well, I actually start to sympathize with billionaires, which is not something that I normally would do, because in what way, shape or form does this speak to sensible government policy? It doesn't. It's clearly boneheaded retardation by Norwegian politicians. Once again, I know that most politicians in Western countries aren't this retarded, but the Norwegian is a special case because they have the mechanism to not have to do this, but do it anyway. So you could be an intelligent Norwegian politician. They just choose not to be for some whatever reason. And this is reflected, and I'll just show you some insights here, so why that's interesting and why Norway is an interesting case. If you look at unicorns in the Nordics, and this is including Finland, which is not a Scandinavian country but has some Swedes, then you can see that there's a large amount of technology companies. And a unicorn is $1 billion company that's based on technology, basically. It's a fancy way of saying that my company grows really fast and I take in venture capital money. And so Sweden is by far the biggest tech hub in Scandinavia, Stockholm in particular. This is somewhat off the back of Spotify and some other tech companies which established their base there. But then you have other large economies like Denmark having 11, and even Iceland has one. Norway only has 6. And the reason they only have 6 is because they stifle innovation in a lot of ways. There's a mentality against this thing because, once again, and this is not to denigrate a Norwegian, but they're mostly just farmers, or like goat farmers, mountain climbers, and fishermen. They're not an innovative race in that way. They produced some of the best Viking Norman soldiers, conquered half the world, and that's about it. And I say that as someone with Norwegian ancestry. It isn't such that they produce much else than that. So good soldiers, war leaders. But then in the realm of business, it's can we fish it or can we drill it? Because that is about it. And in reflection on their economy, that's what they've had to do. Like, they don't need to work very hard because most of the stuff is provided for them. So there's essential services plus a little bit of innovation on some stuff, but mostly not important. And then the other realm of increasing tax base goes into how the state can actually think much more, say, corporatism or fascistically around corporate governance from the state's perspective. If I want wealth from you as a rich person, it can be done in a way that actually encourages growth of the person's company or their ability or their perspective on, should I continue to operate my company in Norway to grow it to be a world leader in whatever technology and whatever industry that it's in. Because Norway already does this. And if you look at their website, which is hilarious because it's very useful because it tells you of the 68 companies that the state owns, what percentage they own, and that its remit is to increase shareholder value. They're not a full owner of all the companies, they're partial owner of some of them. And that is establishing why they operate these companies or own and operate these companies, is to take in dividends back to the Norwegian citizen, which is super admirable, and I really like it. The funny thing is there's obviously an African pictured in here for some bizarre. I've never seen a Norwegian African, given that Norway is probably as far away from Africa as possible. Lucky them. But so that's one of the most ironically hilarious things you can include. But then also they have the Sovereign Wealth Fund, which owns a large stake, almost 2% or 3% of global equities, I think. So you can see that the Norwegian understands capitalistically that ownership is requisite to a economic system that promotes growth, because you say, like, my interest is to increase the value of this company by using smart business tactics, strategies. So if I can do that in a way that grows that, then my tax value or my base of wealth for my country grows. So they know this, which is why it's so mind-boggling that the politicians have been in this dichotomous or this cognitive dissonance around this, where it's, but we still want to punish rich people. And you go, why? Like, if you had a GDP per capita of this amount, is your country not wealthy enough? Like, how much do you need to tax people? Like, at what point is the limit here? Because the tax base as on a personal level is not reflective necessarily of the country going in a positive direction. So communist countries don't need, say, personal income taxes because you don't have any income. they take it all anyway. But you can see that the relationship between taxable income and the care duty for citizens is somewhat reflected in a positive correlated instance. So somewhere like Switzerland, for instance, has low personal income taxes. Luxembourg, Monaco. These are tax hubs, but not really, because you're encouraging a certain type of person to want to live there because they feel as if their worth as an employee or someone who generates wealth is correspondent to how you treat them. It's like, well, none of those countries are bankrupt. None of those countries are struggling. They all have nice infrastructure. It's like, wow, that's not scalable. We can't have that. Could you not? Because I mean, Singapore has a flat tax rate, and they have a really nice country from a infrastructure. I mean, they're soulless for other reasons, being East Asian and all that, but their country as an infrastructure and as a economic unit is very well performing on a very simplified and easy to understand and implemented tax structure. So why is there this inability for Scandinavian politicians, and particularly in Norway, to fathom this? What is the difficulty? You can see here that they've got a spending problem. So leftist politicians in their wise and sage dispositions around, oh, look, free money, let's spend it all, have decided to spend $51,000 per Norwegian. Is that not excessive? Well, you might think so. And you go, look, there's plenty of tunnels and roads that Norway needs to be connected to because of the very far-reaching settlements that they've deemed necessary across their coastline and in their fjords. Fine, sure. Do you think that maybe, though, that this could be reduced with some more perspicacious, more designed planning around who deserves what and why? And to give you an impression as to why this number is so high, I've taken a graph here around immigrants and where they come from. And we all know from the plethora of studies on this that immigrants from outside Western European or descendant Anglosphere countries provide net negative, to a large degree, contributions to the public bourse. So that is to say, if you're an African or a Middle Easterner or whatever, you're a net negative of about €1 million over your lifetime. And I'll let you guess at which line of the three here. Country 1 is the blue line, country 2 is the red line, and country 3 is the green line, is from where? And so very clearly the green line is from the third world Fellaheenes, who have now peaked at something like 40 to 50% of total net immigration. And these people don't leave. They have family reunification, so they bring all their family members from Senegal or whatever shithole they're from, and then just drain and drain and drain. And they have kids here, and those kids are Norwegian. And then those Norwegians, Somali Norwegians, Eritrean Norwegians, whatever, just drain the public purse. And that'll be in perpetuity. So you'll see this number, 51,000, go nothing but up, because now you need to pay for things that you've promised a normal Norwegian. They say, look, I promised in my policy, in my mind, that a pensioner should receive X amount to live comfortably because they contributed all their life to a system and they feel as if we're obligated to now support them, which I think is a noble enough endeavor. But it's also to say that, but now I'm Hakim and his 50 dependents, I'm also supplying the same amount to, because in the lay of the land, in the name of the law, you're all equal and we consider you all the same, even though you've never contributed a single krona to the Norwegian purse in your life. I say, okay, so what's required from me for that? Well, I need to rob rich people. I need to be a Robin Hood here, except Robin Hood in the very, very evil sense. And once that doesn't work, and it clearly hasn't worked, because this graph, so I should have maybe led with this, but it's to say that the amount that left Norway was more than the revenue. So the tax revenue that would have been generated by keeping the system as it was, ceteris paribus, would have allowed for a higher tax revenue than what was given that all the billionaires left Norway. So they ended up reaping less tax money upon the implementation of the system. And this is just you could call this a transactional upfront cost. If you do the net present value of this tax structure, you'll find that there's a huge disincentivization around future wealth growth as well. So in 20 years, have you hampered my designs around productive economic activity. Because if I'm a Norwegian who's got a great idea, I want to work really hard, why the fuck wouldn't I move to Sweden to do it? They don't punish me to this degree for having the ability to actually have wealth. Clearly, they're more concerned around conjuring out of ideas super high-performing companies. So what is it about Norway now that I would want to be around, other than obviously I have a patriotic pull to living in my home nation, but once again I can go on holiday back to Norway every week or 2 weeks if I lived in Sweden. So it's very difficult for me to see what kind of logic was applied here, other than I hate rich people because I'm pathetic and my own ability to earn money is negative. That's why I'm a politician for a Labour liberal left-leaning party. And finally here, I think, is just to show that the way that the tax to GDP ratios skew, and obviously they're much higher than America, for instance, which is held as the primary example of capitalism globally. But it's to show you that the individual tax rate, and as a burden upon societies, is very high in Denmark. It's to 25%. And so they've gone down the route of everyone's being punished, because if you're productive, then you're punished more because of your ability to help others. Norway is got this mixed tax to GDP plurality, whereby there's much more considerations around, say, social security, and this is the employer as well, specifically paying into these things. All of these countries have Sweden, Norway, and Denmark have very high consumption taxes as well. So when you buy consumer goods at the store, it's 20-25% tax on everything. And then there's the same, you could say, Western level of idea of property taxes. So there is a correspondent tax increase on that. But in general, Norway has decided to play the corporate tax game as well. So they've got really high corporate tax rates, and you might say, like, oh, maybe that's a good way of owning. But once again, we go back to the Norwegian understanding that is now apparently forgotten. So this, as I said before, this inability for them to apply unilaterally a very sensible methodology of, if we think the state should be increasing its tax revenue from a company, why not just fucking buy it and own it a percentage? So, like, why do you need 9% of your taxes to come from corporate profits? Why not just give 9% tax breaks to those companies who take in Norwegian ownership correspondent to that tax level amount? Now the Norwegians are happy. The company who is now owned by some of Norway can feel as if they're contributing to the state, and then vice versa. So, oh, but what if there's a huge crash and the Norwegian company's bankrupt? It's like, you've got massive oil, so if there's an oil shock, you're fucked anyway. You may as well at least diversify your economy in a way that allows for more technology and more universally applied sectors and industries. This is the infuriating and banal, just brain dead version of Norwegian history. We'll look back and be like, okay, so how were you able to apply such astute and, say, productive initiatives on your economy around your natural and oil gas, and then completely botch the rest of it like a bunch of meandering retards? Well, it's because you had one decent politician who actually knew what he was doing, and that was it.